What teacher's behavior should have landed them in prison? A teacher locked my epileptic daughter in her classroom and turned on strobe lights during her seizure. I was at home when my daughter Zainab texted me, "Dad, I can feel a seizure coming." My coffee mug hit the floor. Teacher won't let me leave. She locked the door. Then nothing. My phone buzzed with texts from her friend Chloe. Zainab is having a seizure. The teacher turned on strobe lights on the screen and is making it worse. Another text. She's taking our phone's help. Then nothing. I called the school while running through the parking lot, nearly ripping my car door off its hinges. Roosevelt Middle School, how may I? My daughter Zainab, Illinois, is having a seizure in Miss Crawford's room. Room 212. She needs medical attention now. The secretary paused. Oh dear, let me transfer you to the nurse. There's no time. Just unlock the door. I'm sorry, I don't have access to classroom locks during instruction. Let me page. I hung up and called 911. My daughter is having a seizure at Roosevelt Middle School. The teacher locked the door and won't let anyone help her. We're dispatching units now, sir. Stay calm. I abandoned my car at the entrance and sprinted inside. The security guard, Jerome, looked up from his phone. Sir, you need to sign medical emergency. Room 212. I kept running. Jerome jogged after me. Sir, stop. The door's auto-locked during class. I reached room 212, and through the narrow window, I saw Zainab convulsing on the floor, while the smartboard behind her flashed violent strobe patterns. Black, white, black, white. Miss Crawford was sitting at her desk, calmly grading papers as if nothing was happening. I yanked the handle, but the electronic lock held firm against the solid steel frame. I slammed my shoulder into the door while Miss Crawford glanced up, annoyed by the noise, then returned to her grading. Open this door, I screamed at Jerome. I don't have the override codes, only administration have them. Then get them. They're in a district meeting off campus until... I grabbed a fire extinguisher and swung it at the window. The safety glass spiderwebbed but held as Miss Crawford stood up and walked closer to watch me through the cracked glass, shaking her head. I kept swinging, but Jerome grabbed my arm. That's enough! You're panicking! My daughter is dying! The teacher would call if... I shoved him off and kept swinging as Miss Crawford pulled down the window blind from inside, blocking our view entirely. The principal's assistant rounded the corner. What is going on? There's a medical emergency and the door's locked. Mr. Illinois, you can't just... She saw through a crack in the blind where Zainab's feet were visible, rigid and shaking. Her face went white. Oh my gosh, Jerome. Call 911. Already coming, he said. She fumbled with her phone. I'm calling maintenance for the override code. How long? They're across town at the high school, maybe 15 minutes. Zainab could be dead in 15 minutes. Her brain was dying right now, every second destroying more of who she was. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Electronic locks, the lead EMT swore. We need the battering ram from the truck. As they ran back for equipment, I pressed my face to the cracked glass and saw Miss Crawford had lifted the blind slightly to peer out at the commotion, looking more irritated than concerned while my daughter lay dying behind her. The EMTs returned with a tactical door breacher and began slamming it against the lock. Boom, boom, boom. With each hit, Miss Crawford stepped back but kept her arms crossed, gesturing at the students to stay in their seats. The frame finally buckled, and we poured into a classroom that reeked of vomit. 3 students were on the floor, Zainab unconscious and gray-faced, 2 others still seizing. Kids huddled in corners, crying. Miss Crawford stood up from her desk where she'd returned during the break-in. This disruption is completely unnecessary. The EMT checking Zainab's vitals shouted, "She's in respiratory arrest." They started saving her life while another EMT worked on the other students. Miss Crawford approached us as they worked. These children worked themselves into hysterics. I was maintaining order until... You had seizure-triggering strobe lights on, I screamed. It's a biology presentation about neural pathways. These students are being dramatic for attention. Ma'am, step back, an EMT ordered, starting compressions on one of the other students. The principal's assistant was on her knees, holding a student's hand. Miss Crawford, why didn't you call for help? I don't reward attention-seeking behavior. If I called for help every time a student claimed to feel sick, we'd never get through a lesson. Jerome stared at the unconscious children, his radio shaking in his hand. I didn't know. I thought you were just another angry parent. I didn't know. They hooked Zainab onto tubes right there on the classroom floor. As they wheeled her out, Miss Crawford called after us. When she wakes up, we'll need to discuss her disruptive influence on other students. The principal's assistant grabbed Crawford's arm. You need to come with me. Now. I didn't see Zainab again until later that evening, when they finally let me into the hospital room. The nurses couldn't look me in the eye. When they told me her condition, I knew what I had to do next. The doctor walked in wearing scrubs that looked like he'd been in them for 20 hours straight. He pulled a chair next to my bed and started explaining in a voice that doctors use when the news is bad. Zainab had been without oxygen for too long during the seizure, and her brain took damage. The parts that control speech and movement were hit worst. She might never walk normal again or talk like she used to. My chest got so tight I couldn't breathe, but I made myself focus on what came next instead of drowning in it. I stepped into the hallway and called my brother, who works as a paralegal at a law firm downtown. My voice cracked when I told him what happened, and he went quiet for a long time. Then he gave me 3 names of lawyers who specialize in disability rights and education law. My hands shook so bad I could barely write the names on a napkin from the nurse's station. Back in Zeynep's room, I started taking pictures of everything with my phone. Her face all swollen and the tubes coming out of her arms and the machines beeping around her. I pulled out my phone and screenshotted every text from earlier, including the exact times they came through. The nurses watched from the doorway, and one of them nodded at me like she understood exactly what I was building. A police officer showed up about an hour later with a notepad and asked me to walk him through everything. I showed him the text from Zeynep saying she felt a seizure coming and Crawford wouldn't let her leave. Then the ones from Chloe about the strobe lights making it worse. He wrote everything down and said a detective would follow up soon, but the way he looked at those texts told me he knew this was bad. The hospital social worker knocked and came in with a clipboard asking if we needed help with housing or food while Zeynep was here. I told her I wasn't leaving this hospital until my daughter did, and she brought me meal vouchers for the cafeteria and a blanket from storage. My phone buzzed with an email from the school district with some generic message about how they were reviewing the incident and committed to student safety. No mention of Crawford by name, and no apology for what happened. Just corporate words that made me want to throw my phone through the window. Then the messages started coming from other parents who heard what happened. Some said they were praying for us, and others started sharing stories about Crawford's classroom. One mom said her son had panic attacks in that class, and Crawford called him weak. Another dad said Crawford made his daughter stand in front of the class during a presentation, even though she was crying. I saved every single message in a folder on my phone. The principal called while I was reading through them, and his voice was all careful like he'd practiced what to say. He asked how Zeynep was doing, but when I tried to tell him about the strobe lights, he cut me off. Said we should focus on Zeynep's recovery right now and talk about the rest later. I put him on speaker and started recording on my other phone without telling him. That night I tried to sleep in the waiting room chair, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Crawford sitting at her desk grading papers. My daughter was dying on the floor, and that woman just kept grading like nothing was happening. The image played over and over until I gave up trying to rest and just walked the hospital halls. Morning came, and the ICU attending physician asked to speak with me privately. She explained that the scans showed damage to multiple areas of Zeynep's brain. The word permanent kept coming up, and each time it felt like getting punched in the stomach. Cognitive impairment was likely, and we wouldn't know how bad until she woke up and they could do more tests. I wanted to scream or cry or break something, but I pushed it all down because there was too much to do. The anger would have to wait because right now I needed to be smart about this. I needed to document everything and get the right people involved before the district tried to spin this into something else. My phone had 43 messages by then, and I hadn't even looked at social media yet. Someone had already posted about it in the local parents' Facebook group, and people were arguing in the comments. Some defended Crawford, saying she was a good teacher who cared about academics. Others were calling for her to be fired immediately. I stayed out of it for now, but took screenshots of everything, especially the comments from parents who'd had problems with her before. The nurse came in to check Zeynep's vitals and adjust her medications while I sat there making lists on my phone. Names of witnesses and their contact info and what they saw. Timeline of events down to the minute based on my texts and call logs. Every single thing Crawford said when we finally got in that room. The way she called it unnecessary disruption while kids were seizing on her floor. My brother had texted me 3 names of lawyers who handle disability cases, and I called the first one, Geraldine Witt. She picked up on the second ring, and I told her everything that happened with the locked door and the strobe lights. She said she'd be at the hospital by 3 that afternoon. I went back to Zeynep's room and watched the machines keeping track of her breathing and heart rate. The social worker brought me a sandwich, but I couldn't eat it. Around 2:30, I got a call from someone named Ted Bryant, who said he was a detective with the police department. He wanted to schedule an interview about what happened at the school, and mentioned there might be questions about the damage to the door. My stomach dropped because I hadn't even thought about getting in trouble for breaking school property. I told him I could meet tomorrow morning, and he said that would work. Geraldine showed up right at 3 with a leather bag and a yellow legal pad. She was maybe 50 with short gray hair and moved like she knew exactly what she was doing. She pulled out her phone and started recording while asking me to go through everything again from the beginning. I showed her all the text messages and the times they came in. She took pictures of everything on my phone and wrote down names of every person who was there. Then she opened her laptop and started typing something she called a spoliation letter. She explained it would force the school to save all the security camera footage and the data from the smartboard that had the strobe lights. She sent it to the district's legal department right there from the hospital room. While she worked, she told me not to post anything on social media or talk to any reporters who might call. I wanted to tell everyone what Crawford did, but she said we needed to control how the story came out. She said posting angry stuff online could hurt our case later. That frustrated me because I wanted the whole world to know what that teacher did to my daughter. Dr. Gorman came in around 4 to check on Zeynep, and Geraldine asked if he could explain what happened medically. He sat down and talked about something called status epilepticus, which is when a seizure goes on too long. He said the strobe lights absolutely made it worse and prolonged the seizure because they're a known trigger for people with photosensitive epilepsy. Geraldine recorded him saying all this with his permission. He was careful with his words, but confirmed that the visual stimulation from the strobes would have intensified and extended the seizure activity. The next morning, I met Detective Bryant at the police station for the formal interview. Geraldine came with me, which made me feel better. Bryant was younger than I expected, with a notebook and a digital recorder on the table between us. He asked me to walk through everything that happened, and I did, starting with Zeynep's texts. When we got to the part about breaking the door, he said the district was considering pressing charges for property damage. I couldn't believe they'd try to make me the bad guy when I was trying to save my daughter's life. Geraldine squeezed my shoulder, which I knew meant to stay calm and not say anything angry. Bryant wrote everything down and said he'd be in touch if he needed anything else. That afternoon, Geraldine got a call from someone named Darren Sutherland, who was the district's risk manager. She put him on speaker, and his voice sounded like every corporate guy trying not to get sued. He said they wanted to find a path forward that would work for everyone. Geraldine translated that for me later as them trying to limit how much money they'd have to pay. She told him we'd need to see all their documentation first before any discussions. After he hung up, she filed what she called FOIA requests for all the district's emails and messages about the incident. She also requested Crawford's complete personnel file to see if there were any previous complaints. She warned me it could take weeks to get everything, but said it was important for building our case. A reporter named Sloan Randall called my phone that evening, asking if I'd comment on what happened at the school. I really wanted to tell her everything, but Geraldine had said not to talk to media yet. The reporter said she'd already talked to other parents and was writing a story about it. I told her I couldn't comment right now and hung up, even though every part of me wanted to expose Crawford to everyone. The next morning, I woke up to a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was a parent whose kid was in Crawford's class, and they'd sent me a video their daughter took on her phone. The video showed the smartboard with the strobe lights flashing, while you could hear kids screaming in the background. You could even hear Crawford's voice telling everyone to stay in their seats. I immediately forwarded it to Geraldine, who said she'd have her tech person save it properly to preserve something called metadata that proves when it was taken. She said this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed. More parents started reaching out after that with their own stories about Crawford, and I saved every single message. My phone buzzed with a news alert that made me nearly throw it against the wall. The teachers' union had put out a statement defending Crawford's classroom management techniques and talking about how hard teachers work without mentioning that 3 kids almost died. Within minutes, the parent Facebook groups were going crazy, with some people saying Crawford was a monster and others actually defending her, saying kids fake being sick all the time. I screenshot everything while sitting in the hospital cafeteria, trying to eat something even though food tasted like cardboard. A woman from billing found me there and started asking about insurance pre-authorization for Zeynep's ongoing care. She handed me papers showing costs that made my stomach drop. Just the first week was already $20,000, and she needed months of rehab. I told her I'd call my insurance, but she kept pushing, saying they needed authorization today, or services might be interrupted. I wanted to scream at her that my daughter couldn't even talk yet, but I just took the papers and said I'd handle it. The next morning, Dr. Gorman came by for a follow-up about seizure triggers, and I started blaming myself for not fighting harder about Zeynep's 504 plan. Maybe if I'd been more aggressive about making sure every teacher knew about her condition, this wouldn't have happened. He put his hand on my shoulder and reminded me that all teachers get trained about photosensitive epilepsy, and Crawford absolutely knew what those strobe lights could do. 2 days later, Geraldine called saying the district wanted to meet with us and their legal counsel. We sat in a conference room with Darren and 3 other suits who kept saying they were concerned and felt regret, but wouldn't actually apologize or admit anything went wrong. They kept using words like unfortunate incident and miscommunication, while Geraldine took notes, and I dug my nails into my palms to keep from exploding. Darren said they wanted to work together to find solutions, but every solution they suggested involved us not talking publicly about what happened. Detective Bryant called that afternoon with an update that made everything worse. Crawford had hired an attorney and wasn't answering any questions about the incident. The other students' phones were being held as evidence, which meant more families were getting pulled into this mess. He said the investigation was ongoing, but warned me it could take months before any charges were filed if they decided to file them at all. 3 days after that, they finally took the breathing tube out of Zeynep's throat. She opened her eyes for maybe 10 seconds and looked right at me, but there was nothing there. No recognition, no emotion, just empty staring before her eyes closed again. The nurse said it was progress, but all I could see was how far we had to go. The tiny spark of hope I'd felt when she opened her eyes crashed into the reality that my daughter was still trapped somewhere inside her broken brain. I couldn't just sit around waiting anymore, so I signed up to speak at the next school board meeting, even though Geraldine warned me it might hurt our legal case. I needed to do something active instead of just sitting in the hospital rooms and lawyer offices while Crawford was probably at home watching TV. The FOIA request finally came back partially filled, and Geraldine called me immediately. There were 3 prior complaints about Crawford being too harsh with students, and one parent had specifically mentioned inappropriate visual aids in a science lesson 2 years ago. Geraldine said this showed a pattern of behavior that the district ignored. She started preparing subpoenas for more records while I read through the complaints feeling sick that they'd left this woman in a classroom after multiple warnings. Sloan published her article about emergency response delays caused by electronic locks in schools, and even though she didn't name Roosevelt or Crawford specifically, everyone knew what she was talking about. The article quoted safety experts saying schools were choosing security theater over actual student safety. Comments poured in from parents across the district sharing their own stories about locked doors during emergencies. The district spokesperson gave some generic quote about reviewing policies, but it was clear public opinion was turning against them. That same week, Darren called Geraldine with what he called a generous offer. He wanted to set up a restorative justice meeting where Crawford and I could sit across from each other and talk about our feelings with a mediator. The idea of sitting in a room while Crawford played victim and talked about how hard her job was made me physically sick. I told Geraldine to tell him absolutely not, and if he asked again, I'd make sure every parent in the district knew they wanted me to make nice with the woman who almost killed my daughter. Geraldine said my reaction was understandable, but we needed to stay strategic. The insurance company started denying claims, saying some of Zeynep's treatments were experimental, even though Dr. Gorman said they were standard care for brain injury. I spent hours on the phone arguing with people who'd never met my daughter about whether she really needed speech therapy 5 times a week. Every denial letter felt like another slap, while I watched other kids in the rehab unit making progress, and Zeynep still couldn't hold her head up without support. More families started reaching out, including one whose son was one of the other kids who'd had seizures in Crawford's room that day. They wanted to know if we were suing and if they could join. Geraldine started talking about a class action suit, saying it would put more pressure on the district to change policies, not just pay us to go away. The thought of other families going through the same nightmare made me angry all over again. 3 days later, the mail carrier handed me a thick envelope from the school district. And when I opened it, my hands started shaking because it was an invoice for $3,200 for the damaged door and window from when I tried to save my daughter's life. I stared at the itemized list, showing replacement costs for the safety glass and electronic lock mechanism, plus labor charges and administrative fees, while Zeynep lay in her hospital bed, unable to speak. I took photos of the invoice and sent them to Geraldine, who called me back immediately saying she couldn't believe their nerve, but warned me not to pay it or respond until she reviewed our legal options. The next morning, Detective Bryant showed up at the hospital and pulled me into the hallway where he explained that the district attorney's office was considering charging me with misdemeanor property destruction, even though everyone knew why I broke that door. He said he was trying to talk them out of it, but the school was pushing hard, and I might need to prepare for an arrest warrant, which made my chest tight because the idea of being prosecuted while Crawford walked free was making me physically sick. That afternoon, the rehabilitation team gathered in Zeynep's room with clipboards and evaluation forms and spent 2 hours testing her responses and abilities, while I watched her struggle to follow simple commands like touching her nose or squeezing their hands. The lead therapist explained that she'd need intensive speech therapy 5 times a week, plus physical therapy and occupational therapy for at least 6 months, just to regain basic functions, and even then there were no guarantees about how much she'd recover. They handed me a schedule that would basically mean living at the hospital and rehab center for the foreseeable future, while insurance fought us on every single session. 2 days later, I got calls from the parents of the other kids who had seizures in Crawford's classroom, and they wanted to meet about joining our lawsuit because their children were also having ongoing problems from that day. We met at a coffee shop near the hospital where one mother showed me her son's medical bills, and another father described how his daughter was now terrified of any flashing lights and had developed panic attacks. Geraldine listened to their stories and suggested we consider a class action lawsuit, which would have more impact on forcing the district to change their policies rather than just seeking individual settlements. She explained how a unified case would show a pattern of negligence and make it harder for the district to claim this was an isolated incident. Over the next week, Geraldine and I worked on drafting a formal demand letter that cited specific violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, with detailed damages for medical costs and Zeynep's lost abilities. I spent hours writing about how my daughter used to play violin and run track, and now couldn't hold a spoon steady or remember her friends' names, and Geraldine incorporated these personal details to humanize the legal language. She filed it with the district and gave them 30 days to respond while also preparing for the likelihood they'd reject everything and force us to court. Then something unexpected happened when an anonymous source sent Geraldine a PowerPoint presentation from a district training session just 2 months before the incident, specifically about photosensitive epilepsy and seizure triggers in classroom environments. The attendance sheet showed Crawford's signature, proving she'd been there for the full 2-hour session, where they covered exactly why strobe lights were dangerous for students with epilepsy. Geraldine immediately filed an emergency motion with the court to preserve all the smartboard data and electronic door lock logs before the district could claim the system's auto-deleted old records. The judge granted it within hours and ordered the district to provide full access to their IT systems for forensic recovery, which Darren fought but couldn't stop. A week later, I was home grabbing clean clothes when someone knocked, and I opened the door to find two people from Child Protective Services saying they'd received a report about a violent incident at the school involving property damage and needed to assess the home environment. They walked through our house taking notes and asking about my mental state and whether I had anger management issues, while I realized the district was trying to flip the narrative and make me look like the dangerous one. The CPS workers seemed sympathetic when I explained what actually happened, but said they still had to complete their investigation, which would take several weeks. The next day I tried going back to work because we needed the income, but after 2 hours my boss pulled me aside and mentioned I was running out of family medical leave time and would need to decide soon whether to take unpaid leave or risk losing my position. The pressure of choosing between keeping my job and being there for Zeynep's recovery was crushing me, and I sat in my car in the parking lot trying to figure out how we'd pay for everything if I lost my health insurance. 3 days later was Zeynep's first physical therapy session, where they tried to help her stand with support bars, but her legs buckled, and she fell hard onto the mat, crying out in frustration. I had to leave the room because watching my athletic daughter unable to support her own weight was breaking me, and I found myself sobbing in the hallway until the physical therapist found me and sat down beside me. She didn't say everything would be okay or give false hope, but just sat there quietly until I could breathe again, then explained that progress would be slow and non-linear, but she'd seen kids surprise everyone with their determination. That afternoon, Geraldine called while I was watching Zeynep struggle with basic motor exercises and said the district wanted to meet about a settlement offer. We drove to the district office 3 days later, where Darren sat across from us with a folder and slid papers across the table showing $30,000 and a complete non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from ever discussing the incident publicly. The money would cover maybe 6 months of therapy, but signing meant I could never tell anyone what Crawford did to my daughter. Geraldine asked for time to consider while I stared at the papers feeling sick because we needed the money. But staying silent felt like letting Crawford win. The next week, I signed up for public comment at the school board meeting and stood at the podium describing exactly what happened, while half the room applauded and the other half actually heckled me for attacking a teacher who'd been there 20 years. One parent yelled that I was trying to destroy a good woman's career over an accident, while another mother stood up crying about how Crawford had terrorized her son for months. The board members sat stone-faced taking notes while the crowd got louder until security had to step between arguing parents. 2 days later, Sloan's article came out naming specific policy failures, like the 15-minute door override delay, and included quotes from seizure experts calling the strobe light use criminal negligence. Darren was quoted saying the district takes all safety concerns seriously and was reviewing protocols, but the comment section exploded with parents sharing their own Crawford horror stories. That same week, we got a letter from the state education department saying they'd opened an investigation, but warned it could take 12 to 18 months to complete. 18 months while Zeynep needed help now, and Crawford was still on paid leave collecting her salary. Detective Bryant called saying they'd gotten a warrant for Crawford's classroom computer and found she'd downloaded a strobe light app specifically designed for neural pathway demonstrations, plus her search history showed she'd looked up managing disruptive students with sensory overload. The evidence kept piling up, but nothing was happening fast enough. 3 weeks later, Crawford sat for her deposition in Geraldine's office, where she admitted yes, she'd attended the mandatory seizure trigger training, but claimed she was maintaining classroom order and the students were exaggerating their symptoms for attention. She actually said Zeynep had a history of disrupting lessons, and she couldn't let one student derail education for 25 others. Geraldine played the security footage showing Crawford calmly grading papers while 3 students seized on her classroom floor, and Crawford just shrugged, saying she thought they were being dramatic. The court reporter's hands froze over her keys for a second before continuing. A week after that, Detective Bryant called with good news that the DA decided not to file property damage charges against me for breaking the door. Public pressure and the circumstances made it politically impossible, but the fact they'd even considered charging me while Crawford walked free still makes my hands shake. Dr. Gorman spent hours writing a detailed letter for Zeynep's new 504 plan accommodations, listing everything she'd need if she could ever return to the school. No strobe lights, obviously, but also reduced visual stimuli and immediate medical response protocols, and mandatory seizure training for all staff working with her. We were rebuilding her entire educational support system from scratch, assuming she'd even be able to handle a classroom environment again, which seemed impossible watching her struggle to hold a pencil. Darren called Geraldine the next day, threatening a countersuit for defamation if we didn't accept their settlement with the NDA immediately. Geraldine actually laughed on speaker, saying their case would be thrown out in seconds since everything I'd said was documented fact, but the threat showed they were getting desperate. The mediation happened 2 weeks later in a conference room, where the district's lawyer sat next to Darren while they increased their offer to $75,000, but wanted even stricter gag orders. They wanted me to sign papers saying I'd never discuss the incident on social media, or with media, or at the school board meetings, or even with other parents at the school. The mediator kept talking about finding middle ground while I sat there calculating how many months of therapy $75,000 would buy versus the cost of staying silent about what they did to my daughter. Geraldine squeezed my arm when I started shaking because the money would help so much, but signing meant Crawford would never face real consequences. They gave us 48 hours to decide, and I spent them at the hospital watching Zeynep work through another painful therapy session where she cried in frustration, trying to say simple words. The settlement papers sat on my kitchen table next to medical bills that kept coming, and I kept picking them up, then putting them down, unable to choose between Zeynep's immediate needs and the principle of the thing. Other parents from the school started reaching out saying they'd contribute to a fund if I kept fighting because Crawford needed to be stopped, but their donations would be drops in an ocean of medical debt. The 48 hours were almost up when Geraldine called saying she'd pushed them to 90,000 with slightly looser restrictions that would let me discuss policy changes, just not Crawford specifically, and I had 1 hour to decide. My phone rang 20 minutes later, and it was Sloan saying she'd gotten her hands on something big through a public records request. She forwarded me emails from 3 years ago, where administrators discussed the door lock delays during emergencies and decided fixing them wasn't worth the cost. The maintenance director wrote that override codes took 15 to 20 minutes to retrieve and suggested installing manual releases, but the board said no because of budget constraints. Another email thread showed them calculating that the risk of a real emergency was too low to justify spending $40,000 on new locks. I forwarded everything to Geraldine, who called back immediately saying, "This changed everything, because now we had proof of systemic negligence." The district must have gotten wind of the emails because Darren called Geraldine an hour later, pulling their entire settlement offer off the table. He accused me of leaking documents to the media to damage their reputation and said they'd fight us in court if we kept going public. Geraldine had to physically grab my car keys when I said I was driving to his office right then because I was so mad I couldn't think straight. She made me sit down and breathe while she explained that confronting him would only hurt our case and give them ammunition against us. Detective Bryant called the next morning with news that made my hands shake. A student had finally come forward saying she saw Crawford walk over to the computer and turn on the strobe program after Zeynep was already on the floor seizing. The girl had been too scared to speak up before, but her parents convinced her to tell the truth. This wasn't an accident or bad timing, but deliberate endangerment of a child having a medical emergency. Bryant said this testimony combined with the timeline from the texts proved Crawford knew exactly what she was doing. Dr. Gorman asked to meet with me that afternoon at the hospital to discuss Zeynep's long-term care plan. He spread out papers showing projected costs for the next year, and the numbers made me dizzy. Speech therapy 3 times a week at $200 per session. Occupational therapy twice weekly at $150 each. Physical therapy for motor skills at $175 per visit. Neuropsychological testing every 3 months at $1,500. Medications running $800 monthly. Special education tutoring at $60 an hour. The total came to over $90,000 for just the first year, and insurance would only cover about half. He looked me in the eye and said, going to trial meant risking everything because juries are unpredictable, and we could end up with nothing if we lost. The district came back 2 days later with a new offer of $85,000 and looser restrictions that would let me talk about policy changes, just not Crawford specifically. Geraldine said it was the best we'd get without going to trial, and reminded me that $85,000 would cover almost 2 years of Zeynep's therapy. I stared at those medical bills and thought about Zeynep struggling to say my name during her last session. I signed the papers. The state education board announced Crawford was placed on unpaid administrative leave while they investigated the incident. It wasn't criminal charges or losing her license, but at least she was out of the classroom and couldn't hurt any more kids. The district also sent official paperwork waiving all property damage claims related to the door and window I broke trying to save my daughter. Small victories, but they mattered. Zeynep started outpatient rehabilitation the following week with 3 different therapists working on speech and movement and daily living skills. The speech therapist had her practice holding a cup without spilling, and she managed it for 10 seconds, which felt huge after watching her unable to control her hands at all. She said cup clearly, and then dad, and we both cried right there in the therapy room. The occupational therapist worked on basic motor control with blocks and puzzles that would be easy for a toddler, but challenged Zeynep's damaged neural pathways. Every tiny improvement felt like a miracle after the doctors initially said she might never speak again. I got called to testify at a state education panel hearing about school emergency procedures, but they let me do it anonymously behind a screen. I told them about the 15-minute wait for override codes while my daughter's brain was dying. I explained how the security guard had no way to help even though he wanted to. I described watching through the cracked glass as Crawford ignored 3 students having seizures on her classroom floor. The panel members kept interrupting with questions and seemed genuinely shocked by the electronic lock delays. One member asked if I thought the delays directly contributed to Zeynep's injuries, and I said absolutely yes, because every minute without oxygen caused more damage. They took notes and promised to issue recommendations, but I knew how slow bureaucracy moved. 2 months later, the district announced new emergency training for all staff, including override code access for security guards and nurses. They also banned strobe effects and flashing lights in all classrooms without prior medical clearance from parents. The new policies came too late for Zeynep and the other kids Crawford hurt, but maybe they'd protect someone else's child from going through what we did. The news trucks started disappearing from the hospital parking lot after a school shooting in another state grabbed everyone's attention, and I watched them pack up their cameras while Zeynep struggled through another speech therapy session. Sloan sent me one last text saying her editor was moving her to cover the new crisis, but she'd check in when she could, and I knew that meant never, because that's how news cycles work. The online support groups that had been buzzing with outrage about Crawford went quiet as people moved on to fresher anger, and I felt weird about missing the attention, even though I'd hated every second of being in the spotlight. Geraldine called me into her office downtown, where the settlement papers covered her entire conference table, and she walked me through each restriction about what I could never say publicly about Crawford or the district. My hand cramped from initialing every page, while she explained how the money would be placed in a special needs trust for Zeynep's care, and I signed my name on the final page, knowing I was trading my voice for my daughter's future. The check cleared 3 days later, and I immediately wrote checks for the therapy center to continue Zeynep's treatment for the next 2 years without worrying about insurance denials. Dr. Gorman pulled me aside after Zeynep's monthly evaluation and showed me the brain scans side by side with the ones from 6 months ago and pointed to areas that were showing more activity than they'd expected. He said Zeynep was exceeding their initial projections, and her determination during therapy sessions was pushing her recovery beyond what they typically saw with this level of damage. I bought a leather journal that night and started writing down everything that happened from the first text to the settlement, because someday Zeynep would be old enough to understand, and she deserved to know the whole truth, even if I couldn't tell anyone else. I wrote for 3 hours straight, until my hand went numb, and I was only halfway through describing that day in the classroom when they broke down the door. The district called me about participating in their new emergency protocol committee, and my whole body tensed at the thought of going back to Roosevelt. But I knew if I didn't help design the system, then other kids might suffer. I parked in the visitor lot, and my legs felt heavy walking through those same doors where I'd run past Jerome 6 months earlier, and the hallway still smelled exactly the same, like floor wax and teenage anxiety. The committee meeting was in the library, and I helped them write procedures for medical emergency overrides while trying not to think about Zeynep convulsing behind a locked door just 3 hallways away. They implemented everything we suggested, including panic buttons in every classroom that would automatically unlock doors and alert emergency services simultaneously. I heard through the parent network that Crawford had submitted her resignation letter the week before the state investigation was supposed to release their findings, and she'd already started working at a private tutoring center on the other side of town. Another parent told me she saw Crawford at the grocery store acting like nothing had happened and tutoring kids for standardized tests at $60 an hour with no background check required. The anger burned in my chest, but I couldn't say anything publicly because of the settlement agreement, so I just focused on Zeynep's progress and tried to let it go, even though letting go felt impossible. 6 months after the seizure, I was sitting in the rehabilitation center watching Zeynep work with her speech therapist on forming basic words when she looked right at me and said, "Dad," so clearly that everyone in the room stopped what they were doing. The therapist's eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed Zeynep's hand while I completely lost it and sobbed right there in front of everyone because that single word meant everything after months of garbled sounds and frustrated attempts. Zeynep smiled at my reaction and said it again just to watch me cry harder, and the therapist had to get me tissues while other parents in the waiting room pretended not to stare. Our days settled into a rhythm of morning physical therapy, where Zeynep learned to hold a fork steady, and afternoon speech sessions, where she added new words to her vocabulary, one painful syllable at a time. The occupational therapist celebrated when Zeynep managed to button her own shirt, even though it took 15 minutes and her fingers shook with the effort. We had doctor appointments every 2 weeks to adjust medications and monitor for new seizures that thankfully never came, thanks to better drugs and no more strobe lights. Small victories piled up, like Zeynep walking 10 steps without her walker, or saying a complete 3-word sentence, or remembering my phone number when the therapist quizzed her. The justice we got wasn't what I wanted, because Crawford still had her freedom, and the district never admitted real fault, but Zeynep was alive and getting stronger every day, surrounded by people who actually gave a damn about keeping her safe. That's all I've got for today. Appreciate you listening in. Feels like talking with a friend every time. Stick around and we'll do it again soon.